Good afternoon. My name is Curtis King, and I will serve as your MC for this afternoon for the two sessions that we'll have for this current pathway. So we want to welcome you back to Summit 2020, and also want to welcome you back to A Christian Response to White Supremacy. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? This afternoon's set of sessions, as is the whole pathway, is being hosted by Dr. Jerry Taylor and Trice Prince, and it is being done in collaboration with the Carl Spain Center on Race Relations and Spiritual Actions. Our first speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Theodore Francis, and he will be covering the subject, Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Dr. Francis is an assistant professor of history at Houston Tillotson University in Austin, Texas, where he teaches courses on African American, Caribbean, and United States history. He has lectured widely in the United States and been interviewed on television and radio on subjects such as the history of racism in the United States and the Caribbean, Juneteenth and emancipation celebrations, and civil rights in the United States and the diaspora. Without further ado, Dr. Theodore Francis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we can all hear me. Just let me know if I'm having some audio difficulties since we are now in the land of Zoom. Greetings, and I just want to say thank you very much to the administration at Abilene Christian University, and in particular, the director of the Carl Spain Institute, Dr. Jerry Taylor, as well as all the great staff who works along with him. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. As my brother Curtis stated, I am going to be talking about Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, which is a book by James Q. Whitman. I'm going to just pop my PowerPoint up there for us all. Hopefully that is visible in this time now. And what I'll do is do my best to see if I can run through this presentation in a timely manner and then circle back for any questions at the conclusion. Okay, James Q. Whitman. James Q. Whitman. Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. In his preface to this book, he notes that he submitted the proofs for it on Election Day 2016. Election Day 2016. And he did not anticipate the current president winning the election, nor did he anticipate the seeming sea change of racial unrest, which would seem to boil to the surface of American social life in the wake of the current president's election. However, what I like about Whitman's preface is he begins by asking a couple of questions. And he says, why is it that the same aspects of American life that appealed to Nazis almost 75 years ago are with us again? He says it's essential that we ask ourselves, what is it about America that makes it so vulnerable to periodic rot in its standards of decency and the rule of law? He continues, how can it be that America has both so much democracy and yet so much racism? And then he answers his own question. He says, it is a mistake to speak of American racism and American democracy as though they represented two unrelated and opposed strains in the American tradition. Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, engages these ideas. And in particular, I find it interesting because Whitman mines American legal tradition as well as a variety of social ideas that show that America has a significant tradition of racism that accompanied the construction of a so-called democratic republic from its earliest years right on up to the 1920s and 30s when the Nazi regime is coming to power. What we can see obviously on this first slide is an image, of course, of Whitman's book, but a book cover, but also an image from a rally that took place in New York City in Madison Square Gardens in 1939. This was by the American-German Bund organization. And as we can see, quite centrally, there have a number of men there dressed in what appears to be the kind of Nazi brown shirt garb. And behind them is a large image of George Washington. A large image of George Washington. I'm going to circle back to that idea, hopefully by the close of this, but I want us to just think about the ways in which Nazis are not acting as if they're breaking from American tradition. In fact, many times these ideas that fuel Nazism feel or articulated as if they are very much in concert with American political traditions and practices. So let's kind of take a quick little look-see of what Whitman is talking about in this book. Quick little book review, and then hopefully I'll have some time to just spin out a few applications or lessons from it. Whitman's central purpose is obviously to chronicle the history of Nazi efforts to mine American race law for inspiration during the making of Germany's 1935 Nuremberg Laws. In the process, Whitman asks, what do these activities tell us about A, Nazi Germany, B, the history of modern racism, and C, what do they tell us about America? What I'd like to do is just try and unpack a few of these things, survey the landscape of the book, and then ask ourselves a couple of these questions as we close out, before we close out. So what are the Nuremberg laws? Since Whitman's book is really focused around the creation of these laws and the ways in which America or American ideas inspire these laws, well, quick little survey of pre-war Germany. Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party of Germany. And in 1933, in January 1933, he becomes Chancellor of Germany. And in 1934, after the death of President Hindenburg in August 1934, as well as after a series of political assassinations that collectively get known as the Night of Long Knives, Hitler is installed as the Führer and the Chancellor of Germany, right? And by September 1935, we see him in full swing. So roughly about a year after Hitler has been fully installed into power, he is now articulating his vision for how he believes Germany should be run under his control as leader. In September 15, 1935, the Nuremberg laws are announced at a rally, a Nazi rally in Nuremberg, Germany, and they articulate the following. The flag law of the Reich, or of the Empire. Excuse me, I do not speak German, so you German scholars, please forgive me as I butcher a number of names, I'm sure. The flag law of the Reich citizenship law, as well as law for the protection of German blood and honor. These were the first in a series of laws that codified the Nazi racial state, and Whitman explains their various respective US connections. Because, of course, the book is an intricate read throughout these, what I want to do next is just show us what the Nuremberg laws are, and then second of all, just look at just a handful of these influences. First thing, what are these influences? Well, Whitman notes that although Nazis did not directly copy US law per se, Hitler, as well as Nazi legislators, were influenced, inspired, and they actively studied US law and US history before creating the Nuremberg laws. This is critical. Obviously, as a scholar, Whitman is trying to make sure that he does not line himself up for needless academic attacks, because for those of us who are not familiar with the ivory tower, that's what we like to do as academics. We like to snipe at each other and pick holes in each other's intellectual hypotheses and claims. So, you know, he does not want to open himself up to that. But more specifically, as a historian or as a legal historian, I think it's very important for him to make a very specific claim like this and very much mark out the territory that he is covering, as well as the territory that he is not addressing, so that he can be specific in what we are trying to understand. For example, American influences on the Nazi state include a plethora of ideas. First and foremost, Adolf Hitler wrote about and stated numerous times that he admired America as a racial state, or a state that was using a political entity that was using race as a guiding principle in its establishment. And he admired America for the genocide against Native Americans to create what he believed would be a white American state. He heralded this. He thought this was a brilliant move by America to remove what he thought to be the lesser races or the less civilized races of so-called Native Americans. Critical point. Item 2, the Nazis admired as well as referenced US laws against miscegenation, which is sex between different racial groups, as well as prohibitions against interracial marriage. They admired the practice of eugenics, as well as borrowed and were actively in communication with the American Eugenic Records Office, which was established in Cold Harbor in the United States in 1910. As well as they admired movements to create this idea of a racially fit population, using things like state-mandated sterilization, birth control, and other methods. They admired ideas such as US immigration policies that use race in order to control or govern or somehow regulate immigration levels. In particular, they reference things such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, an act which specifically prohibited the immigration of Asian persons to the United States, not just Chinese, but a variety of Asian groups to the United States. And it was various iterations of that law passed again, going on into the early 20th century when it finally abrogated later on. The Cable Act of 1922, which was an act that articulated that women who married men who were Asian men, could lose their US citizenship. The Cable Act of 1922. As well as the Immigration Act of 1924, which set a variety of quotas for American immigration. Well, some people might shrug and say, well, you know, Dr. Francis, that does not sound too objectionable. We just can't let everyone in. Yes, that's true, but how do we establish these quotas? What is the methodology? Well, one of the methods that was used for the Immigration Act of 1924 was that they referenced it to a percentage level of people who were here, groups that were here in 1890. So let's stop and think about this. 1890, well, the US Civil War ends in 1865, rather, excuse me. 1865, the US Civil War ends. During that, so we're seeing what? The enfranchisement of African Americans at this moment. But at this moment, there's not a significant influx of what? Black people. There's not a significant influx of Black people via immigration. However, what is happening in 1890 is what? A significant level of immigration from European countries. So they mark or they index their quota levels from a time when European immigration was particularly high. And they set the standards going forward in 1924 according to those points of reference from 1890. So of course, that Immigration Act of 1924 is going to undoubtedly have what? Very significant differences between individuals from England, Ireland, or Germany, the quota levels for those groups, vis-a-vis the quota levels from any country in Africa. So these immigration policies are very much admired by the Nazis. And last but not least, US practices of creating categories of second-class citizenship for non-whites. And this is something we're going to return to, in particularly African Americans post-Reconstruction, Native Americans, Puerto Rican, and other so-called colonial subjects, which we hopefully get a moment to discuss. Well, let's unpack these Nuremberg laws. The Right Flag Law, the Right Flag Law. Let's look at the context of this. It is very interesting because even though this law is included with a set of laws which seem to be very explicitly racially motivated, this law seems less so. And I admire Whitman for his historical work in digging into the context of this law. But we can say, well, you know, it's a law about a flag. Doesn't seem very racist, Doc. And I appreciate that. And on face value, that was probably my first read. I was interested myself. And what I relearned is this, that the Right Flag Law is linked to a diplomatic incident of anti-Semitism, right? It's a diplomatic incident of anti-Semitism. In July 26, the SS Bremen, which was a German ship, was docked in New York City Harbor. However, there was a lot of protesting going on forth at that moment because between the supporters of Hitler, who were very proud of Hitler for ascending to power in 1934, and opponents of Hitler, including a number of communist supporters. And they were so-called communist agitators, as the newspapers reported. And they were jostling and having this big kind of clash, melee, as the police might say, right there on the dock side, right in front of the SS Bremen, because it was this German ship that was actively flying the swastika flag. A number of individuals rushed the ship and end up getting aboard. 5 of them participate in taking down the swastika flag from the Bremen ship and throwing it into the Hudson River, defacing the flag, trespassing on an international ship. It's a big incident. They get picked up by the police and they're held in police court in New York. However, the judge, the police court judge who was presiding over their case, was a Jewish American by the name of Judge Louis Brodsky. Brodsky acquits the man of destroying the flag, and he proceeds in his decision to weigh in on the political situation in Germany. And excuse me, and he says that, hey, you know, this flag is a disrespectful flag. It is brought in disrepute. It's a flag of piracy, and he condemns the Hitler regime. He actively condemns the Hitler regime. So this is a major incident. German diplomats are up in arms. The ambassador sends letters to the US government, and it's a major case splashed all over the news of Germany. And this is important. Backstory, once again, backstory. Because at that same moment that this is occurring, at the same moment that Germans are writing about how they feel that their ship was attacked by anti-German agitators, that the flag of Germany was ripped down from the ship and thrown into the Hudson River, at the same moment, there's an internal political conversation taking place in Germany. At this moment, you have this transition from when Hitler becomes the leader of Germany, chancellor, and then later on the Führer and chancellor, as well as between Hitler's Nazi group, as well as the kind of nationalist form of Weimar government that existed before Hitler, those particularly loyal to the former president Hindenburg. And at this moment, it was interesting because they had recently passed a law in Germany that permitted 2 flags to be flown for this nation state. One represented the kind of older Weimar group or the nationalist group. The other obviously represented the Nazis, the swastika. So the Nazis were looking for a way in which to have a palatable reason as to why they could project their flag representing their political interests over against the old Weimar flag. And this incident provides a perfect scapegoat for it. And by perfect, because what? They are now able to, one, not only critique America, because they don't criticize America per se, they criticize Jews for passing the decision. They criticize Jews. They criticize this Jewish judge for passing this decision. And they say, you know something? Not only has he disrespected this swastika flag, he's disrespected the whole of Germany. Germans, how can you put up with this disrespect? Not from this American judge, but from this Jew. In the context, America falls hook, line, and sinker for this. Or maybe they somehow are convinced by the ideology of Hitler. We're not sure, and I did not investigate Cordell Hull significantly to know whether or not he was persuaded by that or he just wanted to avert some type of international incident. Either way, he files a formal apology for Brodsky and for the verdict on September 15th. Why is that date important? Because that's the same time that those Nuremberg laws were being announced. So we have this idea of what we can maybe call patriotic racism. Patriotic racism. This idea at the national symbols of the German state, the flag, supposedly represented all Germans. However, the historical context of the flag and the narratives deployed by those who made it the official symbol of the state were antagonistic to the identity of certain German citizens. Stop and think about that. This is a flag that represents the whole country, allegedly. But they doesn't necessarily represent you. Or if it does, those who wave it have certain ideas and beliefs about your position within this nation state. What are you saying, Dr. Francis? I'm saying patriotic racism. It's an idea in which the symbols of patriotism, which should encompass all who live within a particular nation state, are really co-opted or really directed to be what? Deployed against certain groups within the nation state, to exclude some and exclude others, to uplift some and to denigrate others. And the complicated thing about patriotic racism is, if you're one of those groups living in Germany at this time and you say, you know something, that flag don't represent me, guess what you get charged for? You get charged as being unpatriotic. You're against Germany. What's wrong with you for not loving the symbols of your nation state? Well, I do love my nation state. However, I don't feel like my nation state loves me back, might be the reply from a Jewish German or from a German of African descent. However, this idea of patriotic racism says that, guess what? Unless you fully embrace this, even though this symbol is antagonistic to your life as well as your well-being, you are somehow problematic. So it's a form of racism that's difficult to dislodge. And what's interesting is this: one of the Nuremberg laws, in particular the Nuremberg law, which is for the protection of German honor, mandated that Jews were not even allowed to raise the German flag on official occasions. They could raise the Star of David, they could raise other types of flag, but they were not allowed to raise the German flag. Interesting. Let's charge on. Bittman continues and he talks about levels of belonging. So he talks about race and citizenship law. Race and citizenship law. Race and citizenship law. So he talks about these ideas of levels of belonging. First and foremost, the Germans make a split between citizens of the Reich vis-a-vis nationals who live in the Reich. Citizens of the Reich versus nationals who live within the Reich. Reich citizens are German or racially related blood. They are people of a particular type of genetic or biological origins. Reich citizens are not just determined by where they are born. Are you born and or naturalized within Germany? Yeah, but it pushes a step further. It says that your citizenship isn't just about where you were born or where you were naturalized, but who your parents were. Complex. Why is that an issue? Because Reich citizens were entitled to full rights and protections from the state. Reich citizens were entitled to full rights and protections. In other words, the state, by reason of who your parents were, then makes a decision to enter into this social contract with you and afford you, based on who your parents are, full rights and protections. Nationals, mixed race persons, and Jews who were not of German racially related blood, as the legislation stated, would be excluded from such rights, and they would only have partial or no protection from the state. Partial or no protection from the state. And this is later extended to Blacks, as well as people who are Roma, so-called gypsies, later on in November 1935. So September, they begin this. About 2 months later, they extend this. This is particularly important because the Nazis referenced the second-class status of African Americans, citing how they were not allowed to vote freely and they were excluded from full equality in America. Reconstruction legislation, and by that, just broad term, those of us might not up on US history, these are the laws which are passed during that 10 to 15 year period of Reconstruction, which follows the United States Civil War. So between roughly about 1865 and 1877, roughly, depending on where historians draw the line, you see a number of laws being passed. One in particular, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which entitles African Americans to all rights and freedoms as enjoyed by white people, which is an actual quote from the legislation. You have 1865, the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, except as a punishment for a crime. Those of you who've watched Ava DuVernay's interesting documentary on 13, you might follow up on that. You have the 14th Amendment, which says that all those born and or naturalized within the United States are US citizens and entitled to what? Equal protection under the law. 14th Amendment. You have the 15th Amendment, which is passed and says that one's race, color, or previous condition of servitude should not prevent them from voting. However, that was only gendered as well. We need to remember that, right? That did not allow African-American women to vote or non-white women to vote, but it did at least enable Black men to vote at a time when they had previously been excluded for many decades of the US Republic. So what are we saying though? All of that legislation was nullified by a series of US Supreme Court decisions. You have the 1883 Civil Rights Act cases, which abrogates the 1875 Civil Rights Act. You have the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson US Supreme Court decision, which says that racial segregation aboard transportation and other public conveniences is legal as long as it's separate and equal, right? So what are we seeing? We're seeing that the ways that the US Supreme Court decisions undermined a lot of the protections which were supposed to free and fully enfranchise Black people after they got out of slavery in 1865. Interesting point now that we're here about another decision regarding who becomes to be a member on the US Supreme Court. I just thought that was very telling, and it's interesting that I'm reading this book at this particular point in US political history, right? However, what the Nazis did though, is they were saying, listen, the United States has passed a bunch of constitutional amendments, but they don't really mean them because they've allowed this US Supreme Court decisions to undermine or nullify these things. So guess what? We're gonna really actually enforce this in reality and not be hypocritical. We're not gonna leave any points for guessing. We're just actually gonna make sure that, guess what, Jews are not citizens in name only. We are going to undermine their citizenship completely. And part of the purpose of this was to make life so difficult that it would disempower Jews from holding positions of power within Germany, and then slowly exclude Jews from, from German social and political life, so that their businesses could be claimed, or that they would just close their businesses and eventually leave. So before the final solution, they had these ideas that possibly we're going to make life so difficult for Jewish people that it's going to cause them to relocate or leave the borders of Germany. Chapter 2 gets into this idea of race and relationships, race and relationships. They draft this idea of the law for the protection of German blood and honor. Law for the protection of German blood and honor. That essentially restricts race mixing by prohibiting sex and marriage between racially pure Germans and other races. Jewish men also could not employ a German woman under 45 years old in their household. So not only do we see this idea of concern about who Germans marry, and this is critical. Why? Because you've got a previous law that says, guess what? Your citizenship is determined by what? By your race, not just by your place of birth. Second of all, it's concerned all with these anxieties around should German women be close to these sexually lustful and sexually uncontrollable Jewish people who supposedly might molest, attack, or assault German women. For those of us who are familiar with American history and the ways in which there was countless levels of sexual anxiety expressed by whites concerning, oh, will white women have sexual relations with Black men? We can see some instant parallels. And you're not wrong. Nazi lawyers, in the meeting leading up to these Nuremberg laws, they reference American eugenics. And they actually have letters and exchanges between American eugenics associations or organizations and the Germans, and these extended discussions about the ways in which non-white races weaken a population, and the ways that populations will decline if, you know, supposedly the whites have sexual relations with non-whites. Hitler himself was influenced by Madison Grant and others who wrote these books about the passing of the great race and the decline of the white race, and these fears or anxieties about whites having sexual relations with non-whites. Nazis also examined US laws against interracial marriage, as was practiced in 30 or more states. And again, this idea was coming forth that was saying the United States does these things, but they don't fully press the trigger. The United States has disfranchised Blacks. They need to just admit it and just take away the 15th Amendment. was the argument that Nazis would put forward. The United States disallows interracial marriage in at least 30 states. Why don't they just pass a constitutional amendment and make everything very obvious and plain like we are doing here in the Nazi regime? Nazis also found, as a byproduct of this, that such laws required more specific definitions of race. And again, this led them further down the track of racialization. If we were in class, and I mean, maybe, you know, my students would probably get tired of me, but you know, this would be the part where I take a little breather, drink my water, and then go talk to my students about making some observations between these two images. On one side of the picture, we see a younger photograph of Adolf Hitler, the Führer, the individual who is behind, or at least leading, this creation of this Nazi racial state. On the other side of the screen, we see Albert Einstein, the very famous Jewish physicist, mathematician, scholar. What's interesting about both the images, and the reason why I show this slide, is that in terms of the skin color, it's the same. You can't tell any appreciable difference between their skin color, which introduced a number of problems for Nazi Germans who want to construct citizenship as well as belonging all around race. Consequently, by about 1941, as we see this individual in the picture, the photograph, we see him, if you can see my cursor, I'm trying to draw attention to that Star of David. And it was typically yellow, a Star of David that had to be worn on the outside of the coat, either on the front or on the back or some prominent place on the coat. Why? To help German officials, like that individual in the background, to help identify which racial group is and which racial group they are not. Hence the problematic grammatical title of this slide, race is, race ain't. What is race for real? Because if Germans, the architects, or Nazi Germans who are the architects of this system, had problems identifying, it lets us know that there's some specious or some problematic nature about this idea of race. You see, the concept of race is a system of identity categories that's linked to physical appearance and cultural characteristics used by groups in power to classify hierarchical relationships between themselves and other people within a society. Fancy words, big long title if we're taking notes, and it sounds good, and it makes me seem like I'm a real PhD because I've used some big words in the lecture. Great, thumbs up. Now check my creds, I'm good. What does that really mean? Essentially what that means is this, is a system, first and foremost, a system of identity categories. It's used by groups in power to do what? Organize relationships within a society between these groups. It organizes who's on top, who's on bottom. What did we see earlier? We saw what? Reich citizens are individuals or named as individuals of pure German blood or racially related pure blood. And though they are entitled to certain groups and benefits and a certain position within society that others are not. Because race develops over time, it carries historical, political, social, and economic meanings, right? Race is not just simply a biological fact. Because here was the challenge. Even with the passage of these Nuremberg laws, you had a number of German Jews living in Germany, had lived in Germany for years and had not practiced Judaism for decades. So are they really Jews if they're not practicing Judaism? You have a number of people of Jewish descent who are now actively Christians. However, their parents or their grandparents might have been Jewish. You have a number who are agnostic and do not have completely rejected the ideas of faith and are not practicing in one way or another. Consequently, what makes them Jews? Well, the Nazis would say it's their biology. But here's the problematic issue. If a German of so-called pure blood proselytizes and begins practicing Judaism, has their biology somehow changed? So it gets us into these problematic and unsustainable setups of who he is and who so-called ain't. As we see, race is about organizing power in a system. Race is about organizing power in a system. And really through these Nuremberg laws, as well as the laws which follow, It was a way in which to create an ethnic group, or evoke, V-O-L-K, evoke, or a protected white racial group. And what's interesting is they borrow a lot of these ideas of creating a protected elite at the top of the social pyramid group from a number of the racially discriminatory practices in the United States. However, one of the things I think which is a challenge is the fact that there are a number of Black voices on Hitler's American model. There's a number of Black voices on Hitler's American model, or what I like to think of as Black voices on Hitler's American model. What are you saying, Dr. Francis? I'm saying that even though Whitman does an excellent job articulating some of the American legal and social and philosophical precursors for the Nuremberg Laws, one of the things the book does not account for, and understandably so, he has a very narrow and a specific comparative legal project, and I don't knock him for that, but I think it's worthy of us recognizing that Black people in America and around the diaspora were very much aware of some of these similarities between Hitler and Nazism and American life. What you see on this slide in front of you is editorial from the March 1941 Crisis magazine. The Crisis magazine was a magazine put out by the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it's interesting that Roy Wilkins in 1941, he approaches this topic and he gives a shout out, so to speak, to a European writer by the name of Hans Habe. And what he does is he identifies some of the stuff that some of the legal traditions or legal similarities that Whitman identifies back in 1941. And Wilkins publishes this under the title, of course, the Negro Plan for, for America. And it says the Nazi plan for Negroes copies the Southern United States of America. What do you say? Well, let's look at the Nazi plan. The colored people are an inferior race whose, excuse me, I can't see my own screen, whose place must be fixed by the white master race. And he says, wow, this seems to be very familiar to what we see here in the United States. Nazis, the free choice of trades and professions by Negroes leads to social assimilation, which in turn produces racial assimilation. The occupations of the Black colonial peoples and their function in the labor processes of the new order will therefore be entirely determined by Germans. What's this a harken back to? This is a harken back to when Germany had a broader Black empire in parts of Africa, modern day Namibia and others, Cameroon and others. And what's it trying to do? This law is trying to do what? Control the professions of Black people, whether in Germany or in the colonial realm. What does he notice? Hans Habe notices a similarity between what? No Southern state provides training in the professions for Negroes. Vocational training is sketchy and not up to date, as proved by the lack of up to the minute training by Negro boys seeking skilled work in the defense program. What's they doing? What are they doing? They're noticing a number of similarities between American racism, American articulations of white supremacy, and what's going on in Nazi Germany. One of the things we need to think about, just as we kind of point out these kind of interesting lessons or takeaways from the book. One, we see the leader, ideology versus individual. I will argue there's a tendency to conflate Nazism with Hitler and to believe that the death of Hitler was the vanquishing of Nazism. But Nazism was an ideology composed of racist and right-wing beliefs that predated its most vocal proponent, which was Adolf Hitler, and many of its constituent elements outlived Hitler, which returns us right back to those questions that Whitman asked in the very opening page of his book. Why is it that what makes America, rather, so vulnerable to such periodic rut in its standards of decency and the rule of law? How can it be that America has both so much democracy and so much racism? One of the ways in which we get stuck sometimes is this thinking that it's about these individuals and all we have to do is move one particular leader out of position And all of a sudden, the ideologies which animate that leader are somehow vanquished just because that leader no longer holds office. If you wonder if I'm making a hint, yes, I am, you know. If the current president is not elected in November, maybe, maybe not. But if he is not, just because a new president belongs to a rival political party and has not used the same inflammatory language or advocated for the exact same overtly racist practices, does not mean that the ideologies and the systems of racism are somehow transformed. What's powerful in this book, at least one of the things in my estimation, is the ways in which he looks at a wide swath of American law and tradition and history. And you can find racism from the founding of the Republic all the way forward. Consequently, it's necessary to fight racist ideologies and racist leaders and spokespersons. Ideologies are what actually run systems, organizations, and governments, similar to how program codes and algorithms run computers. You can change the color of your laptop. You can do a lot of surface things to your laptop, but unless you change the programming and it's running on, it will do the exact same thing. This is why, just to link right back to that earlier slide I showed us, this is why I think it's interesting that we have some deeper examinations of American history. Nazi supporters in America venerated George Washington. And I thought it was interesting too, because for those of us who are familiar with the Confederacy on their seal, the Confederate States of America produced a seal, and on their seal was a picture of George Washington. So you have Confederates in the 1860s celebrating George Washington, and you have Nazis in the 1930s celebrating George Washington. Why is that? Because they both venerated George Washington's white supremacist impulses to keep African people in slavery and to maintain and govern over a United States of America, which furthered the interests of slavery during his presidency and in the years which followed. And as we're on this topic, you know, this is one of these reasons why we need to challenge or engage our history as well, because it's an important factor to think about these founding fathers and what about these founding fathers is worthy of venerating and what about them needs to be castigated and prohibited and talked on and not repeated. Last but not least, this idea of the global reach of white supremacy. There's a tendency to view issues of race as the sole domain of Black people or people of color, indigenous people, and somehow white people get to go, well, you know, that's you guys' issue, you know, that's not me. I'm glad to see lately, we see in some of the protests, we might see a level of change with that, but time will tell. I'm a historian, so all I can do is be guided by previous moments, not necessarily by all the little things I see, whether it's on social media or in my society around. I think it's interesting though, because it reminds me of a quote from Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. In 1935, fascists, partners with Hitler eventually, under Mussolini, attacked Ethiopia. And in fact, they bombed Ethiopia with mustard gas and other forms of gases that were actually prohibited by a League of Nations treaty, interestingly enough. Selassie, under attack, goes to the League of Nations and issues this speech in June 1936. The emperor says, you struck the match in Africa, but Europe will burn. It is us today, but it will be you tomorrow. He was making an appeal for military aid from the League of Nations. The League of Nations, unfortunately, refuses to help Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians fight valiantly, but the emperor eventually has to leave. He has to flee because Mussolini and his armies are successful in taking a large section of the country. What's your point, Doc? My point is that even though it might start targeting Black people, even though Black people are the initial sufferers or recipients of this kind of racist violence, don't sleep, because once they finish taking the Black neighborhood, they might be willing to take over your neighborhood. What's the lesson? The political, social, and economic appetites of white supremacy will eventually consume European societies. You see, no one intervened in 1935 when Ethiopia was invaded. No one intervened. The League of Nations did not intervene when China was attacked by Japan in the 1930s. However, it eventually unfolded when what? Poland gets attacked, Czechoslovakia, et cetera, et cetera. And now they have a full-on war on their hands and they're going, oh my goodness. And eventually, 1941, the United States gets attacked. Last of the major powers to get involved in the war. They thought they could sit this one out. Interesting. White supremacy came to knock on their door. The murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Botham Jean, Sandra Bland, Mike Ramos, Mike Braun aren't just Black issues. They are problems of unaccountable law enforcement systems that can and do threaten the lives of whites. White people are killed by unaccountable police. You need to be joining us in these marches, these petitions, these demonstrations, these calls to congresspersons and senators to request that the laws be changed. However, if you look at the world through the lens of white supremacy, you'll say, well, that doesn't bother me. That's just people who look like Dr. Francis, and that's his problem. Until the police shoot some shells through your car window and no one goes to jail. The political, social, and economic appetites of white supremacy will eventually consume European societies. The United States, Germany, Belarus are experiencing the rising influence of right-wing and racist groups who are anti-immigration and promote the resurgence of traditional values. White supremacy under different discursive guise. How will Christians, how will Americans, how will the world respond? Hitler's American model, the United States and the making of Nazi race law. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. I'm sure that everyone will agree that you've given us an excellent history lesson and a charge as well as what the future might hold. So thank you for taking the time to break down this incredible history to us. We do have one question in our chat area. I'll take a moment to read that. It says, can you speak to the 1935 Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in New York? As Nazis were patterning their country based upon the United States, were they also attempting to establish a formal public political party or movement in the United States? In what ways might this history be repeated?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that. I'm gonna see if I know I have a little link about that somewhere, because really what that's talking about is, see if I can find a old slide that I just knew I didn't have time to throw up there. But I know we have, for example, this is an image, hopefully we can all see it. This is from New Jersey. This is an image from Sussex Hills in New Jersey, right? And you have this German-American Bund group who are actively supporters of the Nazi Party, right? And they're looking for a kind of political influence in the United States. They are definitely supported by a broad kind of smattering of not just German immigrants in America, but also white racists, such as, you know, folks who are supportive of the Ku Klux Klan. They have church individuals such as Father Charles Coughlin, who is a supporter or thumbs up or gives a thumbs up to the movement. So you do have, you know, they had a youth camp in New Jersey as well too. So it's a bunch of material I just didn't really have time to include in today's presentation. But that rally that the person is referencing took place in February. I want to say it's February 20th, 1939. It was over 20,000 individuals up in the inside the event. Interestingly enough, you see a heavy police presence, which largely protects, you know, the free speech of these Nazis at this time. And I know it seems incongruous, but we've got to recognize that in 1939, the United States is not at war. The United States only formally enters the war in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Consequently, you know, there's no active reason to treat these individuals outside of ethics and morals as somehow a threat to society. And I think it's very instructive, right? Because this image here shows, of course, young people. So while the adults might go off and either get in trouble or get go overseas and unfortunately don't return. You know, these young people grow up with these ideas. And as a result of them growing up with these ideas, for example, where do they go into? Some of them enter politics, right? Some of them enter civic society and reproduce racism in the education system or in the business world. Others reproduce it very formally in the political world. But at the end of the day, that rally was just a flashpoint of broader social context of anti-Semitism and racism in America. And I think it's interesting because it produces these very notable types of images. I think this is upstate New York. It produces these very striking images. But up until the entry into the war, most Americans would not find any incompatibility between the stars and stripes on one side and the Nazi flag on another side. Why? Because there's white supremacy joining them both. They're joined by these broader ideas of white supremacy. So I hope that speaks to the question. Maybe I ran off track a little bit, but I hope that helps.
Excellent, thank you. I have time for one more question. I want to finish up within the next 3 minutes. And this is, what is the Christian response?
I think of one scripture, maybe, you know, better Bible scholars could help me out, but I know there's one scripture that says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them, right? You know, racism needs to be reproved and called out just as surely as the plethora of other things that we love to condemn and criticize, right? We'll spend a whole church conference talking about abortion and, you know, did somebody use the right scripture for communion or for baptism? And we won't say anything about Christians being members of white racist organizations. We won't say anything about Christians who give a thumbs up to political organizations which show no concern for the life, well-being, and health of Black or non-white Christians. Yeah. So as far as a Christian response, there's a book full of biblical texts to show us that racism is unrighteous. How do Christians respond? Well, historically, I've seen Christians reproduce segregation, and that's attested. Dr. Foster does some great work on that. Dr. Taylor does some great work on that. So on one hand, that's one type of Christian response. Christian response, arguably, if Christians are about truth and right and what Christ said, claims to, or said to reproduce, should be one that challenges this, because this is something that harms people. Racism is something that works against people. Racism is something that can inhibit people's capacity to do all manner of the works that people say that they want to do in America, even Christian works, right? Think about a Black church's capacity to borrow money in a racist economy, to do God's ministry. Racism prevents them from doing that. So even when you get beyond racism as an individual expression, racism as a structural expression, there's also something Christians need to be pushing back against as well, too, you know?
All right, well, I will borrow two of the comments in the chat room to close us out. One says, awesome job, Professor Francis, and the other one says, outstanding presentation. Another one has been added, extremely powerful. So again, I think that all the votes are in. This has been well worth our time. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Francis, for sharing.
Thank you, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it, everybody. Thanks very much, Carl Speen Center. Thanks very much, Brother Curtis. Thanks very much, Abilene Christian University, for inviting me.